Welcome to Dark Ascent. Today, we're going to uncover the Everest expedition, where every climber knew there was a reason they shouldn't be attempting the summit, yet each entered the death zone, believing their biggest problem could wait until they were safely back down the mountain. Knowing how this story ends changes the way you see every decision they made. On April 3, 2019, 4 climbers arrived in Kathmandu, Nepal to prepare for an Everest expedition. Traveling on separate flights, they met for the first time that evening at a guest house in Tamil. Acclimatization was 25 years old, from Austin, Texas. She was a freelance outdoor photographer who had built a small but loyal following by sharing her solo trips across the American Southwest. At first, it seemed like she was joining Everest for the adventure and the chance to film a documentary, but there was something about the expedition that almost nobody on the team knew. Months before the climb, Acclis was diagnosed with a seizure disorder after experiencing unexplained neurological episodes. Doctors warned that extreme altitude, exhaustion, and oxygen deprivation could increase the risk of another episode. During the medical screening, Acclis reported previous neurological episodes, but described them as isolated events that had been evaluated and resolved. She did not disclose the later diagnosis or the concerns doctors had raised about extreme altitude. Because the medical team only had the information provided during the screening, they were unable to fully assess the risk. She trained around the condition, hoping preparation would reduce the risk enough for her to attempt the climb. Only a few people close to her knew the full situation, and even they did not know how determined she was to attempt Everest while managing her condition. For Acclis, the climb had become more than a personal achievement. It was a chance to complete something she had dreamed about while she still had the ability to try. Deirdre Langley was 24 years old and from Chicago, Illinois. She was the kind of person who came across as calm and confident, like she always knew what she was doing. She arrived with professional camera equipment and a strong interest in the documentary side of the expedition. But behind that image, things were actually a lot messier. After leaving a failed startup behind, Deirdre was trying to rebuild her career through documentary work. The Everest project represented a chance to establish herself again in a competitive industry. Because the documentary represented an important opportunity to rebuild her career, she became increasingly invested in capturing the reality of the expedition, including the mistakes and conflicts that developed along the way. Mendax Beaufort was 27 years old, from Denver, Colorado, and described himself as a high-altitude expedition consultant with a respected mountaineering blog and an impressive climbing resume. Within the team, he was regarded as the technical advisor, a role that led the others to rely heavily on his judgment. In reality, parts of his reputation were built on claims that did not hold up under closer examination. Some of his reported expeditions contained inconsistencies, including photographs and trip details that appeared difficult to verify. In mountaineering communities, reputations are often built on years of documented climbs, but some achievements can be difficult to verify from the outside. He had climbed mountains like Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, but his real experience at extreme altitude was more limited than he claimed. Another issue was his second-hand oxygen regulator, which started having problems in the cold. During an acclimatization rotation, Karmadawa checked it, made a temporary fix, and warned him to replace it before the summit push. But Mendax believed it was still good enough to use. Dristan Thornton was 26 years old, from Brooklyn, New York, and an aspiring documentary filmmaker seeking a breakthrough project. He assembled the team after months of research, convinced their Everest expedition could produce footage valuable enough to attract commercial interest. He knew the team had strong personalities, but like any expedition, each climber arrived carrying personal circumstances that were not immediately visible to the others. Convinced that the group dynamic itself was a compelling story, he openly documented the expedition from the beginning. The team was aware of his role as the documentary filmmaker and agreed to be filmed during interviews, climbs, and daily life around camp. After the expedition, recovered footage showed that Dristan had captured not only the ascent, but also several moments of disagreement and tension within the team. Their permit was filed through a licensed outfitter in Kathmandu, and their goal was the southeast ridge of Mount Everest from the Nepal side, the busiest route on the mountain. At the time, nobody knew that their summit attempt would happen during one of the most crowded and dangerous periods Everest had seen. So, after arriving in Kathmandu, the team flew to Lukla and started the trek toward base camp. The journey took them through the Khumbu Valley, past Sherpa villages, suspension bridges, and finally onto the Khumbu Glacier, where hundreds of climbers and support teams gathered every season. From base camp, things only got tougher. They had to make their way through the Khumbu Icefall, with its shifting ice towers and hidden crevasses, then climb through the Western CWM, up the Lhotse face, and finally reach the South Col below the summit. The idea was simple: climb higher, then come back down and let their bodies adjust to the thinner air. But even that process has its limits. Above around 26,000 feet is what climbers call the death zone, where the body can no longer fully adapt to the lack of oxygen. Every movement becomes a fight against a slow decline in physical and mental ability. Supplemental oxygen can help, but it can't completely protect someone from what the mountain does to the human body. 2 altitude-related illnesses are particularly feared on Everest: high-altitude cerebral edema, in which the brain swells from oxygen deprivation, and high-altitude pulmonary edema, in which fluid accumulates in the lungs. Haste can impair judgment, coordination, and awareness before a climber realizes anything is wrong. HAP is often more deceptive, with symptoms masked by exertion and adrenaline until movement stops. Without rapid descent or treatment, either condition can be fatal. The 2019 climbing season intensified these dangers. Unfavorable weather kept the summit route closed for much of May, forcing teams to wait while fatigue accumulated. When a brief weather window finally opened, hundreds of climbers attempted the summit within a short period, creating severe congestion high on the mountain. Long queues formed along the fixed ropes near the summit ridge, leaving climbers exposed to extreme cold and thin air for extended periods. Conditions later identified as major contributors to the season's unusually high death toll. The climbers were supported by Karma Dawa, a veteran Sherpa with multiple Everest summits. Like many guides during the crowded 2019 season, he was responsible for more than one climbing group, a reality that inevitably divided his attention during critical moments of the expedition. Between April 3rd and April 7th, the team completed the administrative requirements for the expedition, including permit processing, briefings, equipment checks, and coordination with their outfitter. Each member quickly settled into a role that shaped how the team viewed them. Drystan handled logistics. Mendax spoke confidently about climbing procedures. Deirdre documented the expedition, and Aklis photographed nearly everything around them. To outsiders, they appeared to be a capable, if unconventional team. Like many expeditions, each climber arrived with personal circumstances that were not immediately visible to the others. To the team, Drystan's camera was just a standard part of the expedition's plan. After flying to Lukla on April 8th and beginning the trek to base camp, small warning signs began to show. Aklis had a brief tremor in her right hand while adjusting her camera equipment, something that reminded her of previous episodes, but she never told anyone about it. The episode passed quickly, and because she had not disclosed the full extent of her condition, the others around her had no reason to understand what had happened. Deirdre, meanwhile, started dealing with an occasional dry cough after their acclimatization climbs, and noticed she wasn't recovering as quickly as the others. At the time, though, both of them brushed it off as just another part of being at altitude. As they continued the usual Everest acclimatization process, going higher, coming back down, then repeating it, the problems started to pile up. During one rotation to Camp 2, Mendax's oxygen regulator began acting up as the cold affected the system. Karma Dawa warned him not to depend on it for the summit push and suggested replacing it before the final climb. But Mendax felt it was still working well enough, since it hadn't completely failed yet, and everyone on the mountain was dealing with their own issues. The problem was left unresolved. During a rotation to Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, Aklis noticed her right hand was not responding normally. The symptoms lasted several minutes before improving with rest, but she recognized them as a warning sign she had hoped would not appear at altitude. By the time she returned to base camp, she noticed her right hand was not responding as consistently as it had before. Like everything else related to her illness, she kept the information to herself. At the time, none of these incidents seemed serious enough to alter the expedition's plans. Each was viewed as manageable in isolation, and the expedition continued without significant changes. The prolonged wait at base camp through early May, caused by unfavorable weather and a closed summit window, provided little real recovery. Instead, it exposed tensions that had been quietly developing beneath the team's outwardly functional dynamic. Before traveling to Nepal, Deirdre had already noticed some things about Mendax's climbing history that didn't quite add up. During the expedition, those concerns became harder to ignore as she compared his claims with archived posts, older expedition reports, and public records. Dates didn't always match. Details changed between versions, and some achievements were still difficult to verify. Looking through the expedition records, witness accounts, and available footage, one thing became clear. Base camp did not create those concerns. It only gave them more time to develop. According to later accounts from climbers who interacted with the team, Mendax became defensive when questions about his climbing history were raised. Meanwhile, Drystan kept sending selected footage to a contact at a streaming platform. The positive reactions only made him more convinced that the expedition was turning into something bigger than just a climb. As the expedition continued, some teammates began noticing a shift in Drystan's priorities. At first, he seemed focused on recording the climb itself, but over time, he appeared increasingly interested in the disagreements and personal struggles happening inside the team. Around the same time, a voice memo later recovered from Acclimatiz's personal phone reportedly contained private reflections about her condition and the climb. The contents were never publicly released, so the exact thoughts she recorded remain unknown. Whatever Acclimatis recorded in that memo remained private, leaving only the knowledge that, at some point during the expedition, she documented thoughts she never shared with the rest of the team. Then another tension inside the group became impossible to ignore. Several climbers who interacted with the team at base camp and Camp 4 later recalled that Deirdre seemed increasingly concerned about the direction of Drystan's documentary. Because no single source captured the entire expedition, the final sequence was reconstructed using climber testimony, expedition records, recovered camera footage, equipment reports, and medical assessments. Some details remain uncertain, but these sources provide the most complete picture available. A forecast for a brief summit window reached base camp on May 18th, and the team began moving up the mountain shortly after. By the afternoon of May 21st, they had reached Camp 4 on the South Col, joining dozens of other teams waiting below the summit. According to climbers who interacted with the team, tensions between Deirdre and Mendax had reached a breaking point by the time they arrived at Camp 4. Several climbers recalled that questions surrounding Mendax's climbing history had created distrust within the group, though the exact details of their private conversations were never fully confirmed. Later accounts from people familiar with the expedition raised concerns about Deirdre's condition and ability to continue safely. The source of those concerns and the private discussions surrounding them were never fully confirmed. Records recovered from Acclimatiz's personal belongings later confirmed that she carried prescribed medication related to her condition. However, the extent to which she managed her symptoms during the expedition and what she shared with others could not be fully determined. Interviews with climbers who interacted with the team at Camp 4, along with recovered documentary footage, suggested that Deirdre had become concerned about Drystan's focus on internal team conflicts rather than the climb itself. Teammates later recalled that he appeared more interested in capturing the conflicts and tensions within the group than simply documenting the climb itself. Those accounts suggest that some members of the team questioned whether the documentary was placing too much attention on internal conflicts rather than the climb itself. The team was no longer only dealing with the mountain, they were also dealing with the pressure created within the group itself. Witnesses at Camp 4 later confirmed that tension existed within the team before the summit push. Whether she directly confronted him at Camp 4 was never confirmed. What is known is that tensions surrounding the team's internal conflicts remained unresolved as they prepared to leave for the summit. Several climbers later recalled the atmosphere at the South Col that evening as unusually tense, even by Everest standards. Conditions were good enough for a summit attempt, but the crowded route and uncertainty around the short weather window left many teams uneasy about what was ahead. By the time the summit push began, tensions within the team were still unresolved. The team left Camp 4 shortly before midnight on May 21st and started the long climb along the southeast ridge toward the summit. The conditions were cold but manageable as they moved toward the balcony, where the crowding became impossible to ignore. A long line of headlamps stretched across the ridge, moving only a few steps at a time before stopping again. While they waited in the long queue, the problem with Mendax's oxygen regulator finally started catching up with him. The temporary adjustment from earlier rotations was beginning to fail in the freezing conditions, causing inconsistent oxygen flow that was difficult to distinguish from normal exhaustion at extreme altitude. And the dangerous part was the signs looked a lot like normal Everest exhaustion. He was getting slower more tired and struggling more with each step, but he thought he just needed to push harder. At 28,000 feet, push harder stops being a strategy. But no one can convince you of that when it's the only gear you know. Other climbers nearby started noticing small things too. He was slower during rope transitions, sometimes staring at his equipment for a few seconds like he was trying to figure out what to do next. At one point, another climber even had to remind him to keep moving after he stopped for no obvious reason. Alone, each moment might not have meant much, but together, they showed that something was starting to go seriously wrong. The rest of the team appeared largely unaffected. Acclis moved steadily, with medication that helped manage her condition, but could not remove the risks created by extreme altitude and exhaustion. Deirdre climbed with quiet determination, despite the tensions that had accumulated during the expedition, while Dryston continued documenting the ascent. As the team worked through the bottleneck and higher into the darkness, none of them recognized how quickly conditions were turning against them. By the early hours of May 22nd, the team had climbed above the south summit and was approaching the final sections of the southeast ridge. Dawn was beginning to break, bringing limited visibility through blowing snow and strengthening winds. The route narrowed into an exposed ridgeline where a climber's safety depended almost entirely on remaining attached to the fixed ropes. On either side lay thousands of feet of open air. I can't imagine being in that position, watching something like that happen and still having to make decisions while your own body is already fighting the mountain. Climbers descending from the summit route that morning later reported seeing Mendak struggle during a rope transition and appear uncertain about his equipment. Witnesses could not determine whether he had fully reattached his safety system after the transition. Shortly afterward, Mendak sat down on the slope and, according to climbers and guides who were nearby at the time, seemed unable to get his footing back. It wasn't clear whether it was exhaustion, impaired judgment from oxygen deprivation, or a mix of both, but he struggled to stand and control his movements in the wind and on the steep terrain. Then, near the edge of the ridge, he lost his balance and started sliding away from the route. Witnesses later reported seeing him disappear down the Kangshung face. The fall was not survivable, and his body was never recovered. Even afterward, climbers could not agree on whether he had fully secured himself after the earlier rope transition. When I looked into this part of the expedition, what stood out was how quickly uncertainty became dangerous. At that altitude, a small mistake, a moment of hesitation, or a physical warning sign could become impossible to recover from. Not long after that, Acclis reached another exposed section of the ridge. The warning signs she had been managing throughout the climb began returning. Climbers moving through the same section of the ridge reported seeing Acclis shaking and struggling with coordination, although they could not determine whether the symptoms were related to her medical history, altitude, or exhaustion. Around the same time, stronger winds moved across the ridge. With signs of impaired coordination reported by nearby climbers, Acclis struggled to maintain her footing during one of the most exposed sections of the route. Within seconds, she lost her footing and was pulled away from the protected route, sliding onto the southwest face. Dryston was only a short distance behind Acclis when she fell. His camera was still recording, and he saw the accident happen right in front of him. Climbers who later spoke about the event described him as visibly shaken. Some remembered him standing still for several moments, while others recalled him repeatedly talking about what had happened. Experts reviewing the available evidence could not determine whether it was the result of psychological shock, the effects of extreme altitude, or a combination of both. Dryston witnessed Acclis's fall and continued upwards with the flow of climbers. Witnesses who were near the route described Dryston as appearing shaken after the fall. Recovered footage showed his continued movement toward the summit, but it could not reveal what he was thinking, why he chose to continue. I think this is one of the hardest parts of the expedition to understand. At that altitude, every decision is being made by a person dealing with exhaustion, fear, and a body already under extreme stress. By then, teams had already spent hours in severe congestion, high in the death zone, where exhaustion, cold, and oxygen deprivation were affecting many climbers on the route. Witnesses later reported that he appeared distracted and unusually slow during several rope transitions. Near the upper section of the southeast ridge, he paused at an anchor point where climbers were required to unclip and reattach their safety systems while moving between sections of fixed rope. While also managing his camera equipment, he appeared to struggle with the transition. Climbers nearby later disagreed about exactly what happened. Some believed he clipped incorrectly, while others thought he may have briefly become detached from the fixed line altogether. Moments later, he lost his footing on the exposed ridge and fell. Whether the accident resulted from exhaustion, hypoxia, distraction, shock from witnessing Acclis's death, a rope transition error, or some combination of those factors could never be conclusively established. His fall carried him down the same face where Acclis had already come to rest. Months later, during a recovery and route survey effort below the route, debris containing Drystan's helmet camera was recovered. The memory card was preserved and became part of the material reviewed during the investigation into the expedition. Deirdre Langley was the only member of the team who made it back from the summit route alive. Witnesses on the route reported that Deirdre turned back after Acclis's fall and began descending toward Camp View. A Sherpa from another expedition later helped guide her back toward Camp Beaufort. Climbers who saw her arrive at the South Col described her as exhausted but still alert, able to speak and move on her own before settling inside the team's tent. My focus while reviewing this moment was not just where Drystan went next, but what the footage could and could not reveal about his decision. What no one realized at the time was that Deirdre was likely already developing high-altitude pulmonary edema. Medical assessments, based on expedition records and witness descriptions, suggested that her symptoms were consistent with developing high-altitude pulmonary edema. However, because early symptoms can resemble ordinary exhaustion at extreme altitude, the seriousness of her condition was not immediately recognized. The South Col was crowded with climbers returning from the summit, many of whom required oxygen, medical attention, or assistance getting settled. Amid the confusion, several climbers later recalled seeing Deirdre resting in the tent and assuming she was recovering from the climb. As her condition worsened, the seriousness of her illness went unrecognized and she was left alone for several hours. Later that afternoon, a Sherpa from another expedition entered the tent and found her unresponsive. Climbers nearby reported signs consistent with severe altitude illness and respiratory distress. By the time she was discovered, her condition had already become critical. The last surviving member of the expedition had died alone at Camp 4. After the events of May 22nd, Karmadawa reported the losses, and authorities began coordinating recovery and notification efforts. Recovery teams later confirmed Deirdre Langley's death at Camp Free, while the conditions above the South Col and the continued flow of climbers made recovery attempts higher on the mountain impractical. Acclis Ascara's body was later sighted high on the southwest face and identified through her equipment. Though the location made recovery impractical, Mendax Beaufort was never found and was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. In the weeks that followed, Nepalese authorities, expedition operators, and U.S. consular officials worked to document the deaths, notify families, and review what happened on the mountain. Expedition operator incident reports and family release materials suggested that Acclis died from injuries sustained in her fall, while her underlying neurological condition was considered a possible contributing factor in the events leading up to it. Medical consultants reviewing the available evidence found signs consistent with severe pulmonary edema associated with high-altitude illness, while Drystan Thornton's injuries were consistent with a fatal fall from extreme elevation. Because Mendax's body was never recovered, no autopsy was possible. The 4 deaths had different immediate causes based on expedition records, witness statements, recovered footage, and medical assessments. Several contributing factors emerged: incomplete disclosure of medical risks, unresolved team tensions, equipment concerns, and decisions made under the physical and psychological strain of extreme altitude.